Right, so we'll get going there. So obviously, first of all, thank you for attending today's webinar. Going to go through bridging finance and how it's used in the real world and how it can be used properly. So first of all, a bit about myself. I'm Matt Reeves, as you can see from the picture, and I'm one of the senior finance brokers here at Prop. In terms of what I do, I've been working for the company for 3 years now. My main remit is I look at bridging finance, although we do also do buy-to-let, commercial development finance, and secured loans as well. So quite a wide remit of different options that we can help support clients with. In terms of today, so also we're going through the webinar and this will be recorded as we go along. So each and every one of you that have attended today will be sent the notes and everything out via email after this. And most importantly, you will have the chance to ask questions as we go along. So there will be two Q&A sessions. So any questions you've got at any stage, if you can just drop in the question box. And then what we'll do is when we come to the Q&A sessions, we'll just stop and try and go through as many as I can. Hopefully, I'll have most of the answers for you, but if not, what we'll do is I'll go away and I'll come back to you personally and give you the information that you're hoping to get. Okay, so first of all, so going through the agenda of what we're going to look at today. So first of all, we'll look at what bridging finance actually is and how it works, when bridging finance makes sense. We've got a couple of case studies to look through. So actual personal case studies that I've looked at. So we've got a HMO conversion and we've also got a chain break as well. And I'll also explain a bit more about that in a bit. We'll then stop for one Q&A session. So obviously any questions you've got throughout the first few sections, if you can pop in there as soon as you can, then we'll answer that on the first Q&A session. And then what we'll do is we'll go on to the rest of the slides. So we've got, the real cost of bridging finance and what that looks like. We've got exit strategy reality, so what that looks like again and what lenders are looking for, and a bit around due diligence for yourselves and key takeaways, and another Q&A session at the end. So again, any questions, just pop in that and we will go through it. So a bit about us. So Prop as a business, obviously we're there to be a price comparison website to try and bring clarity to the specialist finance space. So the idea of us being there hopefully is your one-stop shop for property investment. It is built for investors in the main, and it was built by people that are, in the know and have done this for years. So the idea of it, we've got a prop portal, which is a really good tool for anyone to use. So you can go on there, you can browse properties. So that's pulling information from across the internet. And then you can go on there, you obviously can save your shortlist of properties that you're interested in. And then what we can do, we actually can go in there and start trying to build finance packages for what that looks like. And then hopefully you can see whether or not it's actually a suitable return on investment and something that would work for you in reality. So what is bridging? So it's designed to be short term and it's designed to solve a temporary problem. So it's not the right solution for every scenario and it's not going to be used in every single case that you come and you can help with. So it's designed for speed and flexibility. So I would say in cases where, maybe a standard mortgage or a buy-to-let mortgage aren't quite the right solution because of speed purposes, then that's when bridging comes into effect. Also, in terms of flexibility as well, so we get a lot of properties that are unmortgageable or you're unable to obtain standard types of finance. So again, that's where the flexibility element of bridging comes in. It's not designed to be a long-term funding solution. So typically speaking, I'll go into a bit more detail about this in a bit, but it's typically not a long-term thing. So generally, terms of 12 to 24 months. So it's designed to be an interim stopgap to get to the end goal of what you're looking to achieve. And then it's mainly used, I would say, when other types of finance just won't work. So that could be because of an auction timeline or because the property is not suitable for standard types of finance. This is when bridging comes into play, and you can use it as a tool as an investor to realize your long-term strategy and goals. So how does it work? So for us, for the Pop Portal, so obviously you can go online, you can find properties that you're interested in. So ideally spotting the opportunity, whether that be, a standard property, it could be something on auction, whatever it may be. Obviously save it to there and have that as your opportunity. What we then do, we then go through our comparison process here. So us in the background as brokers will go away and look at what the best options for you and your scenario is. We're completely whole of market. So again, we're not tied or restricted to use any certain lenders. So we should have a pretty holistic view of, where we can place you, where we can try and secure the best rates for you as well. Also worth noting, we are on the preferred or premier panel of quite a lot of the mainstream lenders as well. So quite often we can try and get you preferential rates or discounted rates, or maybe some standard brokers out there can't get that for you. Once we've looked at it, obviously, so we're looking at the bridging finance for this. So typically speaking, it's short term and it's interest only. And generally speaking, it's between 6 to 18 months is the average term that we see, depending on how complex the project is and what you're looking to do. With bridging, I'd say it's very much asset-led finance rather than affordability-based finance. So it's very much based on the actual property we're looking at and how you're going to get and pay it off. So we move on to the structure and the clear exit, because the other key thing about bridging finance is how we are going to pay back the lender. So the two key things really are is the property suitable? And generally speaking, a valuation would determine that. And then is there a clear exit plan or exit strategy in place? The lenders need to know from the outset that you've got the ability to pay them back, and we can prove that from the start. And then moving on to the exit, generally speaking, obviously we'll go into a bit more information in a bit, but usually clients are looking to refinance that. So it could be a refurb, and then you're looking to refinance that at the end. It could be you're looking to sell it because your plan is to flip properties and take the profit there. Or it could be to move on to longer term finance. So when does bridging finance actually make sense? So there's a few more reasons in here that I won't be able to touch every single reason why or how you could use bridging, but some of the key ones that we generally see and the more common uses. So we get a lot of auction cases, a lot of auction purchases. So I would say 9 times out of 10, they tend to be 28-day deadlines, which trying to obtain standard types of finance, trying to go in on a residential mortgage or a buy-to-let mortgage, it's just not suitable for that time frame. And you potentially are going to risk losing your 10% deposit that you put in day one. So that's when bridging comes into play. So it's a short-term fix to acquire the property, and then you can either do your refurb, or even if it's a ready-made property, it's ready to go, then we can start putting into action your buy-to-let refinance straight away. There are other types of auctions as well. So we do also see 56-day auctions, or quite often referred to as modern method auctions. There might be a few different options for that. But again, typically speaking, 28 days are the more common ones that we come across. Chain breaks, again, another key scenario. So this tends to be more on people's residential property. Generally speaking, so if a client's found a property they're interested in buying and they're looking to sell their current residential in the background, but they haven't got a buyer for that, and they don't want to miss out on that onwards property, then we can do bridging for what we call a chain break scenario. So we look at giving them the funds to acquire the new property, and then they've then got 12 months in the background to sell the property to then repay the bridging loan. Few different reasons we'll go into that, and I'll go into touch that a bit more later on as well. We deal with a lot of commercial to residential conversions as well. So people could be buying a fully commercial unit or a semi-commercial unit, and they're then converting that into a fully residential property, whether that be like a block of flats or a single unit. Again, we see a lot of conversions in that sense. Key thing to note is quite a lot can be done nowadays on permitted development, although still some do require full planning permission for us to be able to do that. I'll touch a bit more about this one in a second, but looking at no deposits, so we get quite a lot of questions around how can I secure assets with no deposits. whilst generally speaking, if you're just trying to secure on one property, you would need some kind of deposit. If you do have equity and assets in the background, actually, we can draw from that equity to reduce your initial input, or actually, sometimes you don't need any initial input into the deal to be able to secure the property. And then also we'll go on to refurbishments as well. So light and heavy and what that looks like and differentiating between those two different types. So no deposit. So what that looks like in reality. So if you're looking to buy a property, and the illustrative numbers I've given you here is for 250,000. So typically speaking, you go in to buy an asset, you can generally borrow up to about 75% on a property purchase using bridging finance. Now, sometimes there is exceptions to that rule, so we can get a bit more on the loan to value. Sometimes we can get a little bit less. Again, it depends on the scenario, what you're looking to do, and the property itself. So generally speaking, in that scenario, you can borrow around about £187,000. Now, when you factor in fees, it might be a little bit less than that if we use that as the figure to go with now. Now, that means you then have to find the deposit funds, plus if there's refurbishment costs, again, having to find that up front. And then any could be legal fees, valuation fees, stamp duty, again, that needs to come out of your pocket. In this scenario, if we were to use a background asset, so this could be your main residential property, or it could be a background investment property you've got, a buy to let, then again, in this scenario, if it's worth 500,000 and you've got a current mortgage on there of 150,000 or no mortgage at all, then actually we can use the equity in that property to go towards this deal. So if we work on a second charge scenario basis, we can generally borrow up to about sort of 65, 70% on that property, which means maximum borrowing against that, including your current mortgage, is about £350,000, meaning we can potentially raise up to £200,000, including fees against that. So when you combine both properties together, actually we could be looking at a total lend of 387,000 there. Now, you might not need that much, but again, that could cover the full purchase price of 250. If it's a large, extensive refurbishment, that could cover all of your refurbishment costs. And actually that can then go towards your stamp duty, your legal fees, and any other associated fees to do with the loan. So actually, in that scenario, you don't need to put any money into the deal to make it work. So refurbishment. So we'll touch upon light and heavy and sort of the differences and what that looks like. I think it's key to know differences between the two because most lenders will have different products, whether it's a light refurbishment or a heavy refurbishment. Generally, well, yeah, not generally speaking, but always light refurbishment are going to be slightly cheaper on rates and also slightly cheaper on the ongoing fees that you tend to find with bridging lenders. So for light refurbishment, you're generally looking at a cosmetic uplift, improving appeal on the property. And that could come in the form of painting and decorating, new flooring, a kitchen and bathroom refresh. It could be a full round of electrics and plumbing across the property. Curb appeal upgrades. We're seeing quite a lot of rendering of properties as well to, really refresh the front of properties. Internal configuration. So when I say that, you could be turning a property from one bed into two. It could be a HMO conversion where again you're reconfiguring the internal of the property to convert it into an HMO. But generally speaking, you're not looking at structural works or extensions. That tends to fall into the heavy refurbishment category. So heavy refurbishment, and this is when we're talking more structural and transformational work to a property. And then we're looking at structural alterations, so removing load-bearing walls. That could be extensions, loft conversions, large HMO conversions. So again, your small internal reconfigurations can be done under light. If you're looking to add extensions and reconfigure the property on a large HMO, that's generally going to be falling within heavy refurbishment. You could be looking at roof replacements, and generally these kind of refurbishments will often need planning or permitted development. So always speak to like a local council offer exactly what it falls under, and obviously do your prep work into what that looks like. So timeframes, bridging is designed there to be speed and transact at speed. So obviously, once you come and speak to us, usually we'll come back to you with terms issue within 24 to 48 hours. So, and when I say terms, that would have been us speaking to business development managers from lenders and actually having an informed decision and making sure we come back to you with accurate information. Whilst it's never 100% guarantee that they can lend, hopefully it's a very good idea that, we're in a suitable position to move forward for you. And then once we submit the case, I would say usually the average is around about 7 to 14 days for the offer to be issued. Again, in certain circumstances, if it's a really well packaged case and we get all the documents quickly, it can go through quicker. If we're still waiting on time delays, you could be waiting for a builder's contract, etc., then the possibility is it could be a bit longer than that, depending on the lender. I would say the average completion that we see, and just being honest, is around about the 4 to 6 week average. So we can complete quicker than that. And like I say, we do auction cases very regularly where we have to complete within 28 days. All I would say is if it is a really quick completion timeline, then usually we have to then narrow that down to a select 3 or 4 lenders that we think and we trust are going to get it through in that timeline for you. If it's not as time critical, then maybe we can get you a lender that's going to be a bit cheaper, but might take a little bit longer to go through the process for you. And then speed will depend on valuation access, legals, and borrower readiness as well. So again, very key to make sure you pick the right solicitor and also having all the information from yourselves up front and doing your own due diligence beforehand really comes into play. Generally lenders want us to fully package the case before they send it to them. So that means all the documents that we need to be up front and we need to submit along with your application form. So loan term, so minimum time usually is 6 months, and I would probably never recommend going below that. Just because obviously if anything happens with a refurbishment or your finance takes a bit longer, or if you're going to try and sell the property, you're really trying to restrict how much time you can do. And with bridging, if you take a longer term and pay off quicker, generally speaking, there's no penalties to that, and you only pay for the interest you've used. So you're always better off giving yourself a bit of buffer time just to make sure that your exit stacks up and you've got a bit of time to play with and you don't go over term. I'll say the typical one we see is 12 months across the board. Now, like I say, some will be longer than that, but the average we tend to see is 12 months. And then the maximum is up to 18 to 24. I would say, generally speaking, this tends to be more for your heavy refurbishment stuff where the works might take, 4 to 6 months, and you're looking at a sale, which again can take 4 to 6 months. And then you've got a bit of buffer there just to make sure that, you're not running things tight on the timelines. And then exit time. And like I say, it's always dependent on when you think you can get out of that. So, you know, however long you think the refurb might take, however long you think it's going to take to get that exit sorted, or we always recommend giving you an extra 3 to 6 month buffer, again, just to make sure you allow for any overspill on the works, or if the sale is going through and you lose a buyer, and again, it just gives you a bit of extra buffer time that you've not got pressure to get it through and done in time. So exit timing, so sale once the value uplift is achieved. So again, that's when you're looking at an exit of selling the property, or we look at refinance once work's complete or the property's mortgageable again. So if you're doing a light refurb on a property that wasn't mortgageable, you've now got it to a state where it's ready to be refinanced elsewhere. That's when we'll start looking at the exit for you. And then the exit can happen at any time during the agreed terms. I think, as I've just mentioned, that generally speaking, there's no exit fees with most lenders, and you're normally paying for the interest you've used up until that point. So when does bridging not work? So I think, first of all, having no clear exit, I think the lender really needs you to be clear on what you plan to do and how you plan to pay them back. Now, don't get me wrong, that can change throughout the process. If you were originally planning to refinance a property and actually after you've done the refurbishment, you decide, actually, no, I want to sell that, that's fine. Ultimately, the lender is really caring about how they're going to get their money back. So Whether or not that changes throughout the process, that's fine, as long as the timelines still work. Overestimated gross development value. So that's, the end value of what the property's worth at the end. So again, I'll go into some more information around this in a bit, but being really clear on your numbers and actually knowing and understanding the market and what properties are worth. Having no contingency. So again, whether you build that into the build costs or, having some spare cash, it's always advisable to have some kind of contingency in the background. So if you think the works are going to be 40,000, for example, have an extra five, £10,000 just in case, because things do go wrong, things change, and you're always better off having enough money to make sure you're covered rather than, having to stop a build halfway through, trying to gain extra funds and then continuing in. And then inevitably you're then trying to push your timeframes really tight. Having thin profit margins, ultimately you're all in it to make some kind of profit on the deal. And lenders want to look for that as well. So if you're going into it and the profit margins are very thin from the outset, lenders are going to get nervous. They're going to try and understand how and why this is a suitable proposal for them. And some have a certain percentage margin, what they're looking to see to make the make the project viable for them. Don't be too emotional, I would say. So don't just jump into the first thing you see because you think it's a good opportunity. Take your time to really assess the market. Take the time to make sure that the property you're looking to invest in is the right one for you and it fits for what you're looking to do. And then don't just try and figure out the finance later. If you're looking to refinance a property and that's your exit plan, it's not a case of we'll deal with that at a later date. Actually, we need to be looking at that right at the start of the process so we know it actually works. There's no point in getting you onto a bridging loan and saying you want to refinance it, and then the time comes and it just doesn't work. And then you're stuck there on that term, either having to sell the property or trying to find a way how to pay back that bridging loan. So some myths versus reality. So a few things that pop up. So bridging finance is only for desperate borrowers. And that's just simply not the case. So it's there to be strategic and it's not for desperate borrowers. It's there as a tool, as a short-term tool to enable you to get to and achieve your long-term growth within a property. Bridging is too expensive. So I think first and foremost, it isn't ever going to be the cheapest way of financing a property. The rates are more expensive than a normal mortgage or a buy-to-let mortgage, and that's always going to be the case. But it's designed to be fast, it's designed to be flexible, and it's designed to be used in circumstances where you simply just can't get that standard type of mortgage straight away. So quite often people think you might need perfect credit as well. And again, it's not necessarily a deal breaker with bridging lenders. So as I mentioned earlier, bridging is more asset-led finance and it's not credit score obsessed. So although, don't get me wrong, if you've got lots of missed mortgage payments in the background and loads of defaults, then yes, that can impact the kind of lender that we can go with. And there's some lenders that won't be interested in that. But actually, there are still bridging lenders out there that will do that, even with, I've had status 6 mortgage payments. I've had people that are actually going into receivership that we still manage to help. So again, the key thing is, does the exit stack up? So again, if you're trying to get a refinance with loads of missed mortgage payments, in reality, that's probably not going to be possible. So, but if you're looking to sell the property, then that's definitely something we can look at. And it's only for property developers as well. So again, a bit of a common myth. It's used by more than investors, and quite regularly we help clients that aren't investors. So I revert back to that chain break scenario that I talked about at the start. A client's found a new dream home that they want to move into. Again, that's not for investors. That's for someone trying to secure their new property. We work with assisted living facilities where clients need to move into assisted care facilities because that it just determines their life is at that stage. Again, absolutely we can help them with that. So again, it's not just for property developers, it can be used in many different scenarios. And bridging is risky. So what I would say to that, so yes, I mean, with any type of property finance, it does come with their own risks. So it's a bit like a normal mortgage. If you don't pay your mortgage back, at some stage, they're going to start repossession proceedings. And it's the same with bridging. But again, using the right way with the right plan in place, then the risk isn't the product. The risk is, the planning and what goes into it from the start. Um, and like I said, we will work with you throughout that process. Once, if we put you into a term, it's not a case of, you're left to your own devices. We'll be following up with you throughout that term, every 3, 6, 9 months to make sure you're on course. And if you're not, that's okay. We can then start looking at alternative solutions to see how we then prevent you going over term on your bridging loan, and then what the all different alternatives are for that. So I'm going to go on to a case study of one I looked at for one of my big investors that I work with. And it was a HMO conversion up near Warrington, I believe it was. So they acquired the property for 105,000. Initially, it was a two-bed terraced house, and we converted it to a six-bedroom HMO. The bridging loan we managed to achieve, so we managed to get a bridging loan of 91,000. So that was quite a high leverage. Again, the way we did that is the certain lender we used was able to offer a higher leverage because works are being done to the property and there was a significant uplift. We did a 12-month term. Again, although we thought he could probably turn it around in 3 or 4 months and the refinance might take a few months, we went with a 12-month term just to give that extra 6-month buffer that I talked about. The interest we looked at was 0.94% per month. Again, I would say that's typically on a slightly higher side than what we see, but just due to the scenario, the loan size, and the works he was looking to do, that was the best rate we could get at the time for him. So the total costs, so including the refurb, stamp duty, legal fees, etc., all of that came to 45,000. And then when we came to do the refinance for him, we got a post refurb valuation of 255. So a very significant uplift on that. And we were able to utilize an investment valuation on the HMO to really drive that up for the client. And what that meant was his profit purely on the property was 105,000. So obviously working off the valuation minus the cost he spent plus the value of the property initially. And then when we refinanced up to 75%, he was able to withdraw 132,000 from that. So that more than covered his initial deposit and refurb costs. And then it gives him the money to then go on and potentially start 2 new projects straight away. Is actually what he did. He went on and got 2 more HMO properties, and he was able to really scale up quite quickly using that method. So case overview again, I've just talked about HMO conversion, and that was nothing external. It was all internal configuration. The benefits to that, so I see a big uplift in the value of the property, and the client was able to walk away with that money. And again, he's now scaled up his portfolio really quickly. I think he's gone from around about 5 to about 18 properties within the space of 2 years. So really escalated that in a good way. Some of the challenges, obviously, I've mentioned about the securing the higher leverage initially. So not every lender can offer that higher leverage. And we did use a service interest rate, which I'll go on to a bit more detail about to secure that high leverage. And then also getting an investment valuation on the refurbishment. So it's a big question we get. Can we get an investment valuation on a HMO? Absolutely, yes, we can in the right circumstances. So is that property fully configured as an HMO? Have you got to a stage where, you've got 6 bedrooms, 3, 4, 5 en suites to that? And basically the touch point you're looking for with lenders is, if a value goes in there and it couldn't easily be transformed back to a family home and it's fully configured as an HMO, then absolutely we can look to try and get an investment valuation on that, which generally speaking gives you a bit of an uplift on the bricks and mortar value of the property. So on to a second case study, and for this I've used a chain break scenario that I worked on recently. So a client had found a new property they were looking to buy as their main residence, their dream home at 1.16 million. And then they also had a property in the background they were looking to sell. But unfortunately that hadn't sold, hadn't had much interest. And if they didn't find some kind of short-term solution, they would have missed out on that property they wanted to secure. So we managed to secure him a loan of 900,000 to complete on that bridging loan. And again, we did it over a 12-month period. So although they thought they could sell that property or their background property within 12 months, again, we go for the maximum term possible, which when you're dealing with regulated bridging loans, which is on properties you live in or plan to live in, the FCA cap it at 12 months. So the case overview. So a couple of key things to notice. Again, the property required a little bit of refurbishment. So again, the onwards property may not have been suitable or it would have been in touch and go whether or not they could have got a standard mortgage on there. And they ended up spending £80,000 on renovation budget to get it up to a stage where they were happy with it. So the benefits of that. So again, good broker and lender collaboration. So having good relationships with lender made sure that it was a success. Um, we had a couple of different exit strategies on that as well. So again, it's good to have, if necessarily your primary exit doesn't quite work, it's always good to have some kind of backup in place just in case it doesn't pull through. And then the challenges. So obviously we were maxing out on the loan to value for the client. Again, generally speaking, at higher loan values, some lenders start capping the loan to value and things like that. So it was key that we maximized it out for them. And the slightly quirky thing with this is, so generally speaking, your most common exits are sell and refinance. With this one, the client had an actual stocks and shares portfolio of around about 1 million in the background, in USA stocks and shares. And if he cashed them in now to try and secure that property, his tax implications are actually more expensive than taking out a bridging loan to pay for the property. So that's when we were reliant on those stocks and shares portfolio as the exit. And we worked with a lender to get it past their risk team to agree to that. So again, we used that as the exit strategy. Again, just slightly different to the standard ones we tend to see. So I'm just going to pause quickly in that for a slight Q&A session. So I'm just going to go through any questions that have popped up on the webinar so far. So I've said someone's come up with how long can you have a bridging loan for? So again, I think I touched on it in the last one. So if it's a regulated loan, so just to remind you, that's on properties you plan to live in or have lived in, and it's 12 months. If it's for an investment, so an unregulated loan, then anything up to 24 months is the maximum term that you can take. Can I get 100% bridging finance? So again, I think I touched upon that. Yes, you can, but it's dependent on you having background assets and equity in other properties to make that a reality. If you're doing it on a singular asset, then generally speaking, no, because we can end up 75%. The only exception to that rule, I would say, is if it's a very much below market value transaction. So you could be buying it for 100,000. In reality, it's worth 150, and a valuer backs that up. Then actually we can get higher leverage on under market value assets. Typically speaking, anywhere between 85 to 100%, depending on the lenders. You still need to put some kind of money into that for like the fees and a little bit towards a project. But again, we can try and maximize on leverage for you. What are the upfront fees with bridging applications? So I'll go in, I've got a slide on that in a minute. So if you're happy, I will touch upon some of the upfront fees to what that looks like. And how much can you borrow and is this based on your income? So the amount you can borrow is very much based on the assets, not your income. So again, typically speaking, up to about 75% of a property is what you can get. Again, some exceptions to that rule, depending on the lender, depending if it's a refurb project where you're adding value to it, we can get slightly higher leverage. And in terms of income, it's far more less reliant on your income because the lender is more reliant on the suitable security and the exit being in place. Now, don't be wrong, if that exit is a residential remortgage where the amount you can borrow is directly correlating to how much your income and what your outgoings are, then absolutely, then your income is important and we need to prove that you can pay back the lender from the outset. If you're doing a refurb and you're selling the property, then your income is kind of redundant. It's not important in the process. And again, even more so for like a buy-to-let refinance. Again, as long as we can prove that you can refinance onto a buy-to-let mortgage, again, your income isn't an important factor in it. Now, quite a lot of lenders out there for experienced landlords and even non-experienced landlords on a buy-to-let mortgage can still lend without any background income. Although there are some that still have a minimum income requirement. But again, we'll do all that due diligence for you throughout this process. And what was the interest rate on my second case study? So the second case study for the chain break, I believe that was at 0.68% per month is what we looked at on a regulated bridging loan. Although what I would say is that particular lender has actually just recently reduced their rates by 0.05 across their range. So I think the most recent rates from the same lender is their most expensive rate is 0.59 and their cheapest rate is 0.53% per month. So again, the rates are hopefully on a downwards trajectory based on, background and cost of borrowing in the market at the moment. And do you still need a deposit with a bridging loan? So hopefully I've covered that. So again, if you're looking at singular assets, yes, you're going to need a deposit. If you're happy to use other properties in the background, then there definitely are cases where we can use your background equity to prevent you needing to put money into the deal and having a deposit up front. Is there any more questions from anyone else before I'll move on to the rest of the slides? If not, what I'll do is I've got a second Q&A session at the end, so anything else there, I can come to at the end. So yes, Kate's asked if there are any arrangement fees. So yes, there are. I'll cover it again shortly, but typically speaking, your arrangement fees or setup fees to the lender are generally 2% of the loan amount. Now, depending on the lender and the scenarios, there are times when using our optimizer process, we can reduce that for you. So when we go out and if we approach multiple lenders, which is what we generally do on potential applications, if we've got 4 or 5 lenders all interested in the same deal, then we can try and play them off against each other to try and reduce whether that be the interest rate, whether that be the arrangement fees. But again, that's what we do in the background to try and drive down the cost of the borrowing to you and try and find you the most suitable and cost efficient deal for what you're looking to do. So yes, the 2% fees, generally speaking. Interest rate wise, I would say it very much depends on the case. So with your interest rates, it is dependent on things like, is it a light refurbishment, heavy refurbishment, what you're planning to do to the property, and then it is also very much loan to value sensitive as well. So if you're down at 50% or less loan to value, then yes, hopefully you're going to be towards the bottom end of that market. If you're maxing out at 75%, then generally speaking, you're going to be towards a slightly higher end. I would say the average, anywhere between sort of 0.6 to 1% is generically the sort of typical we see. Again, as I mentioned earlier, there is some below that, and there is some higher than that, depending on the case itself. Right, so what I'm going to do, perfect. So what I'll do is I'll continue with the rest of the slides. Again, if you get any questions as we go along, please keep putting them in there and I will answer any more questions at the end of the presentation. So some key information to gather. So I think it's really, really important to make sure that you do your due diligence and you do as much research into what you're looking to do as possible. You'd be amazed by the amount of clients we get that come in and just don't have a clue on what they think it's worth, what they think it's going to be worth. And it really is a key deciding factor on whether or not that's going to be a profitable project for you. So check the true market value. Go on Rightmove, go on Zoopla, look at estate agency websites in a local area, find out if what you're looking to do really is comparable. Things like, is your property or the property you're looking to buy, is that the most expensive one that's sold in the local area in the last 2 years? Again, I'd be nervous about that because I know lenders will be nervous about that. And actually, how much uplift can you have if that's already the most expensive property in the local area? Understanding the refurbishment cost is key. Again, the amount of clients you speak to that just, say it's 30,000, it's 40,000, when actually haven't really done any due diligence into that. I think it's really important if you're going to go and do a refurbishment, speak to a builder, speak to a contractor, and really understand what that cost is going to be because, the difference in 10, 15,000 pounds in refurbishment costs could be the difference between you making a profit on that project or you making a loss. So again, take the builder with you or take someone you know that's experienced with you to viewings to really understand how much it's going to be and get those quotes in early. Don't have it as I'll get that sorted after I buy the property and hopefully it all stacks up. Confirming realistic end value. So again, if you're looking to add value to properties, do your research on what it's going to be worth at the end. Because again, you need to make sure that it all stacks up and the numbers work out for you. Again, speaking to agents, looking at Rightmove Zoopla to see, if you're changing it from a 3-bed to a 4-bed property in that area, go and do your research on what 4-bed properties are sold for in that area and make sure that you're happy with it. Ultimately, if we go in with sort of pie in the sky numbers from the outset, when the valuer goes out to determine these figures, it can quite often lead to disappointment if you haven't done proper research. Because if they down value on the current value or the GDV on that, then inevitably your loan size is going to reduce in line with that. Review planning requirements, so again, a really key thing. If you're going to do extensions or loft conversions, dormer conversions, then it's really key to understand whether that is going to need planning permission. You see quite a lot of cases now where it can go through in permitted development, which I suppose is easier and an easier process for lenders. And generally speaking, all lenders can consider things when they're going via permitted development, although certain things would have to go for full planning. When you're looking at full planning, again, we can look at options where you need to acquire the property, go away and get planning, and then you can start the refurbishment at a later stage. But generally, we have to do what's called like a holding bridge or an acquisition bridge to buy it first. You would then go away, get full planning permission, and then we can move you on to a refurbishment facility, either with the same lender or a new lender to enable you to then crack on and do the works. But if planning's in place beforehand, it's a lot easier. The lender knows what they're doing, it's transparent from the start, and you can move straight on to that refurbishment facility straight away. I think it's key to speak to a broker early. So come and speak to us. We can understand the ins and outs of the deal. We can work on the numbers for you. So again, you're making sure that the numbers stack up, that it's worthwhile you going in, the profit's there for it. We can also do some background checks for you as well. So we can go in and look at the property. If that's on Rightmove, Zoopla, generally speaking, if I've got a client that's interested in a property, I'll go and look at the property to make sure, I also agree with their perception of that. So we quite often get people will think, oh, it's ready to be let out now. I'll go and look at the pictures, and I know from a lender's perspective straight away that's not mortgageable. So we then have to look at a light refurb for that. Other things we can do, so we'll look at things, a website called Street Check. What that does enable us to look at like things like the amount of council owned properties in the area. Because again, if you're looking to move on to a buy-to-let or residential mortgage, that can be a key determining factor on whether or not you'll be able to get that mortgage in place. If there's a really high percentage of council owned properties in that area, that does put off certain lenders. And whilst it's still possible to refinance, you may find yourself having to pay a slightly higher level of interest rate. But again, we can determine that pretty early on, so you know the figures that you're going to be dealing with come refinance. An instructed, experienced solicitor. So again, I would always say hold fire instructing anyone until we know what lender we're putting you with. So quite often lenders will have their own select panels that you can choose from on what we call a dual representation basis. And that means they act for you and for the lender. So generally speaking, that's one set of legal costs and one set of solicitors to deal with. So I would always say that's a preferable route to take. But generally speaking, lenders will have like a very small panel of who they allow. So I would always say, let's work out what lender is going to be most suitable for you, and then we'll look at the solicitor on that. But I think it's really key, whoever you choose, if that be someone you know or someone from the lenders panel, make sure they're experienced in bridging. Due to the timeframes that we're generally looking to complete in, a standard run-the-mill conveyancer isn't going to be suitable for that. And the amount of times I've had conveyancers turn around and say, we're not happy to act or we don't want to deal with a bridging case, it does happen quite frequently. So do your due diligence on them as well. Make sure that sister has done with bridging before and they understand the complexities of what that looks like. And again, ensure strong profit margins. So making sure that it works for you financially, but again, also for the lender as well, because the lender wants to make sure that you're bought into the project, that it makes sense. If it's a loss-making option from the start, then again, you're going to struggle to find a lender to get on board with that because there's not as much buy-in from you to see it through if it's going to potentially make you a loss. So the real cost of bridging. So again, I know there's been a couple of questions on there. So hopefully we'll cover the main points of that and the different fees and things to look out for. So interest rates. So they're typically quoted monthly in short-term finance. So bridging, so I think I mentioned earlier, anywhere between sort of 0.53 to sort of anywhere up to the top end of about 1.1% is what we typically see. And the payment of interest, so I'm going to go down to the next slide now and down different types of interest payment. But it's also important to understand how interest is paid and when you pay it and different types of options that you have. So service interest. So service is when you pay the interest monthly. So a bit like a normal mortgage or a buy-to-let mortgage, you would pay the monthly interest amount ongoing basis until the loan is redeemed. I suppose the key factors to this is and why you potentially might consider a service loan is it helps reduce the total loan balance that you pay at the end. So with the other options that I'm about to cover, you're paying compound interest. So you're paying interest upon interest. And generally speaking, the amount you have to pay at the end is more because with service, you're just paying the interest on the initial loan balance month per month. The other key thing why you might use service interest is because you want higher leverage. So if you're only securing against one asset and you've got maybe a small deposit, and you really want to try and maximize the loan you can get, then with service, you can typically borrow more upfront than you could via retained or a rolled interest route that I'll go on to in a second. One thing to mention though is, so with service interest, it is affordability based. So a lender needs to make sure that you can afford that monthly payment. So a bit like a normal mortgage, typically they'll look at bank statements, pay slips. They need to be sure that you've got enough surplus income monthly to make that interest payment. So retained interest, so that is where there's no monthly payments for the duration of the loan. So they deduct the interest up front to cover that. So typically the way that's structured, so if you borrow up to 75% of the property, if the interest payments are around about 8 to 9%, they deduct that from the 75, and what you're left with is what you actually receive or the net loan. So typically borrowing on single assets, the net loan is often around about sort of 65 to 68% is what you actually receive towards the purchase. So no monthly payments are required. So I suppose the plus side of that is from a cash flow perspective, it's quite good if you want to keep your surplus income for the refurb as you go along. But also bonus that there's no income tests on that as well. So they're not generally going to look at bank statements and pay slips to determine whether or not you can afford that monthly payment. And again, useful projects without immediate income. So rolled up interest, it works, to be honest, very similar to retained interest. Typically speaking, retained interest is a little bit more expensive because the way it works is you're paying 12 months of interest on the initial balance, on the total balance from the start. Whereas rolled interest, you're paying interest on the loan as it accrues throughout the term. So typically speaking, rolled interest is slightly cheaper and offers you slightly more borrowing than retained. Although again, not all lenders offer it, but again, that's something that we will look at in the background to try and find the most cost efficient solution for you. And again, it's all paid in full at redemption. So both retained and rolled, all of your fees and your interest are paid back at the end of the term. So whether that be when you come to refinance, you pay it back, or whether you come to sell the property all of that is paid back at the end of the project. So on to costs, so things to be aware of. So typically speaking, a bit like a normal mortgage anyway, you'd have a valuation fee to pay. Now, there are circumstances when we can potentially get what we call automated or desktop valuations, which are more of an instant decision and generally speaking, either free or £40, we can run them for you. And if that passes, great, we can use that, although that's only used with certain lenders in the market. Some don't offer a facility for desktop or automated valuations. Now, what was her valuation fees? Typically, the higher the value of the asset or the more complicated the build or structure you're looking to do, generically, they're going to move on to higher valuation fees. If it's a £200,000 property that just needs a lick of paint, for example, they're going to be on the lower end of the sort of fee scale, which you're typically looking at maybe £300 to £500. If you're looking at a massive extension, HMO conversion of a £750,000 asset, then it needs a more in-depth valuation, and typically that is going to be into four figures. So arrangement and administration fees. So I think typically touched upon the standard arrangement fees across the board, and most lenders are going to be 2%. Again, we will look to drive that down for you, but if you use that as the main sort of basis of that, that's what every lender starts out at. And then administration fees as well. So some charge minimal admin fees or application fees, however you want to word it. Some can charge up to about £1,000 for application fees. It really does depend on the lender. So legal fees, again, typically they depend on the property value, the loan size, how complex the build is, how many properties you're looking to secure against. But a key thing to factor in is so dual representation is where a solicitor will act for you and for the lender. So typically they're on the lender's panel. Now, that's always going to be the most cost efficient way to go. So if you're happy to use one from their panel, that's going to be one set of legal fees and one set of solicitors to deal with. Some lenders actually insist on separate representation in the bridging world. So there are lenders out there that will insist on you having your own solicitor and the lender having their own chosen solicitor. But it is worth noting that you still cover both sets of legal fees. The lender doesn't cover their own legal fees. So it's normally a more cost efficient, sorry, it's more a more costly process. So again, when we come back to you with the overall package and try and look at the most suitable lender, that things like that we factor into it because on a large scale case that could be upwards of 3, 4, £5,000 in legal fees that we need to factor into that equation. And asset manager fees. So if it's a more complex build or a heavy refurbishment, then generally speaking, not only do you have a valuation fee to go out, they'll send out an asset manager or a quantity surveyor out to inspect the property as well and make sure the numbers stack up, that the works you're looking to do work. And if you then do what's called a drawdown facility, where we can get the option with lenders where you can borrow money for works as well, then typically they will send out an asset manager or a quantity surveyor prior to each drawdown. And the way the drawdown works is you could borrow, initial money towards the purchase, and if the refurbishment's then going to cost £100,000, we can get that funding for you with certain lenders. Although one key thing to factor in is that it's always funded in arrears. So, say for example, you're borrowing 100,000 and you want to split that up in two drawdowns of 50,000 each. You need to front fund that first 50,000 and the lender refunds that to you. They will never forward fund that. So that's just one key thing to factor in when you're looking at refurbishment facilities with drawdowns. And then ongoing fees. So again, if you're looking at drawdowns, then things like ongoing fees, so drawdown fees or asset manager fees can be applicable throughout the duration of the loan. Again, that's the kind of things that we'll look into for you and the kind of things we'll factor in when we're looking at the most suitable lender. So exit strategy, one of the key factors into this. So it's something we have to prove from the outset with the lender. So if that's not, squeaky clean and tight, the lender isn't going to accept your application. So whether that be through some of the methods that I'm going to go through, we have to prove that from the outset. So if you're looking to refinance onto a buy-to-let mortgage, we have to get you a mortgage in principle during the bridging application to make sure that's actually viable. And again, if you want to use us for the refinance at the end, again, we can look at that for you moving forward. So common exits. So the most common ones you see are sales. So you're looking to flip a property, you refurb, you flip it, you sell it. Refinance, so whether that be onto a residential mortgage or a buy-to-let mortgage, moving that funding onto a cheaper facility. Again, that's a more common thing we see. Asset disposal, so a bit similar to my scenario earlier where a client had stocks and shares in the background. Again, sale of things like that can be an exit strategy in place. And then additional securities as well. So if you're securing funding on that, but you're selling background properties, again, we can look at that as the exit. Typically speaking, a lender might want to have a charge on that property just so they've got a bit more control over the scenario. So for the exit must be evidence. Again, I've just touched upon the refinance. Again, we have to prove that from the outset. So it's not something we can take on a whim. We have to prove to the lender that you could get a refinance on that. And for the sale, again, look at things like market demand, sensible valuations. And when you get that valuation report, generically speaking, valuers will look at the marketability on that. Quite often they'll give a market valuation, a what we call a 180 and a 90-day valuation. So that's if the property had to be sold within 90 days or 180 days, what its value is as well. So some key takeaways. So bridging is designed there to be a tool. It's not a long-term solution. And it is more costly than standard types of finance. But again, with that comes speed, with that becomes flexibility in a tool to really extract profit margins from projects. Your exit must be credible. The numbers must stack up. So again, looking at the profit margins to make sure that that all works. And again, used properly, sorry, it unlocks opportunities and profit margins in properties. So thank you for joining us. What I'm going to do, I'm just going to go through some Q&As that have come through in the last section of the thing. And then what I'll do is I'm going to pop on my details here. So if you've got any more personal questions you want to ask me after the webinar, I'm more than happy if you take my contact details down and you can send me an email, give me a call directly as well. But just going through a few questions that have popped up. So are you able to send the recording afterwards? Yes, the whole webinar has been recorded. So everyone that's attended today will get sent out the webinar afterwards. So you can run it through, watch as many times as you want. If there's any questions you've got, again, come back to me. And then if I plan to go into auction, can we go through a shortlist with you? So absolutely. So with all the key investors we work with, I would say, if you're going to auction, you've got 4 or 5 properties that you're interested in, absolutely come and speak to us. We'll look through all 5 for you. If we need to do desktop valuations for all 5 for you beforehand, then absolutely we'll do that. We'll do the due diligence because ultimately we want to make sure when you're going into auction, you've got as much confidence that should you win, then we're going to secure that finance for you. Obviously, there's no ever 100% guarantee that we can. There's always a risk with auction. But again, we want to put you in that best possible position that when you put your 10% deposit down and when you win that auction, you trust that it's all going to go through in time. Is there any further questions anyone wants to pop in the question box? If not, okay, perfect. Well, thank you everyone for coming today. What I would say is if any of you have any further questions that you think about after today, I will send out my details. You'll get my direct contact details. So whether you want to contact me, you want to pick up the phone, I'll have my direct contact line there. Or if you want to drop me an email and just go through any questions you may have, whether it's just talking about bridging finance, something's popped up and it's a light bulb moment you want to talk through, or if you've got any upcoming properties that you want to run through and discuss, then absolutely, please get in contact. More than happy to help with any questions you've got. Thank you all for attending. I hope you have a wonderful evening and hopefully I will speak to some of you soon.